Hey, it's Chris. What are we talking about today? We are going with World Order from Hegemonic Games. What we're talking about is a 2 to 4 player area majority style taking on one of the 4 superpowers from the 2010s and trying to dominate the world. Well, score the most victory points. Who is it right for? My pros, my cons, my recommendations, what to know about this to help you figure out whether or not this game is right for you. You ready? Let's go. As I mentioned, this game is 2 to 4 players. 4 is going to give you the fullest extent. We'll talk about that a little bit later because it does do a little clever automa at the 2 and 3 player account to adjust. But the gist of this game is you're taking your slight asymmetric approach to world domination and you're giving the rest of the world a taste of what they may need to deal with. Your individual player board, as you can see here in front of you, is going to have several different parts to it. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the dynamics of the individual factions and then how that plays into the overall structure of the game, just so you can get a gist of things. So when I make the other points, obviously you'll have a little bit of understanding from that aspect, right? You can see here that I have in front of me the production of many of the resources that I'm going to be creating in the first place. And you can see I've got the 3 up here and then the 4 down here, the primary and the secondary ones. You can see that they start at a certain level. Below that actually is the focus that you're going to be taking on a round by round basis on this 6-round game as you keep track on the side of the board over here. You score at the end of round 3 and 6 with some slight differences that will change up how you may be positioning in a round by round basis for the area majority of the regions on the board in the first place. And that's where this ties into hegemony if we're looking at that apples to apples. This game is not going to be significantly shorter than hegemony. The actual dynamics of your factions overarchingly are very, very similar, but it's how you strategically, but more so tactically, take it on a turn-by-turn basis. And that's where these 3 foci come into the aspects of what you're going to be dealing with, because you choose one of them and it basically specializes you out for that round. All of them tell you what to do and then give you a different ability that's going to take place, be active as a passive during the rest of your round play. And on that round, what essentially you're going to be doing after you take the production phase, gather your resources, your tokens, and then do whatever it says here, readying country cards, spending resources, or getting production based on what's available to you along the way, is that you're going to be taking 6 cards from your deck, and you are going to be then looking at them and choosing 4 of them on an individual turn-by-turn basis, playing one at a time, going around the table. This is by far and away going to be the biggest time suck of this game, and that's where a lot of these games, as other people have said elsewhere, tried it out online, in-person prototypes, other reviews, this game is going to take you 3 to 4 hours with 4 players when you're learning it. Now, it does significantly reduce that with repeated play, obviously, but it's because when you have these cards, right, this rule book is not thick. The actions on the cards and how you're going to be linking them, how you're going to be planning them out from a strategic standpoint in one of the 4 different types of ways. As you can see, all of these cards in the lower left have different iconography to represent the 4 different types of them. I'm actually missing one of the military cards right here, if I can pull one of those up for you as well. So you can kind of see that those are the different things you're going to be utilizing, and they correlate a little bit to what the foci are down here. And so then you're going to be playing one of these from your hand as your turn, taking the actions accordingly, or potentially even laying it face down to indicate I don't want to use it for that. I'm either out of money and I need to spend this card as an action to gain more money to buy all the things that I need along the way, or to take one of my 2 potential of 5 at the beginning of the game strategic asset cards here. And what this is another way of giving your unique faction some asymmetry. You can see I have 5 in front of me here, and what you're going to do is you're going to randomly choose 2 of these at the beginning of the game and throw the other 3 into the box, again, to give some slight asymmetry on top of what you're getting from your action cards to begin with. And you can use those action cards in a face down manner to play one of these, which again are going to allow you a little bit stronger, but a little bit more different power altogether. The bottom of the card, your resources gathered there, but then you're also going to be acquiring on your turn potentially growth cards, and growths are like sort of the world order equivalent of a tech tree, if you will. I don't have them laid out because this thing, truth be told, is a little bit of a table hog. This board is relatively big, and having each of your unique individual areas is going to take up a significant portion of table space in the first place. And so what you've got here with the growth cards is you've got them numbered 1 to 5 in the upper left-hand corner, the victory points in the upper right-hand corner, and the ability of it on the bottom, with the cost on the left side. And the tricky part with this is that there's only a limited number of each of these growth cards. There are, as you can see here, 3 diplomatic initiatives, but there are other level ones as well. Industrial development, which again is going to cost you something completely different. But then here's the tricky point, right? Once you get a level 1, you have to get one of the level 2s next time. Once you get one of the level 2s, you have to get a level 3. You always have to grab one that is higher than the previous. And there are only so many of each of these. So depending on what order you get them, that's going to determine what's available to you or what other people are doing. And so that's going to be one of the more indirect ways that this game is going to allow you to have some influence on other people in a more direct manner, if that makes sense. Because ultimately, this game is much less interactive than you might be hoping for if that was one of the big things you were wondering about. This game is a little bit of multiplayer solitaire with a little bit of slight, bluffing Cold War style, if you will, on the board. And what I mean by that is it's really about threat and influence. The threat and influence you are amassing in the different regions on the board in order to, potentially cause your opponents to lose victory points is really what you're doing. And so how take that do you like it from that aspect, not a direct conflict, because that's not what happened, right? And so the thematic and historical implications and incorporation is there in that dynamic of a mechanic on the table. Now, there's a lot going on in this game of the actual phases, and they have some really nice player aids that you can see here that are laying out exactly what you're going to be doing. And I'm not going to break down what a full action turn is going to look like and what you can do, because as you can see, you can improve relations, which allows you to pay cost diplomatic style in order to recruit one of these cards that's available to you from one of the different regions. You essentially pay the cost in diplomatic relations in the upper left-hand corner, and then you allow yourself to then be allied with this one in front, which is going to allow you to utilize it not only in trades, but also diplomatic, but also the war effort in how you so choose to use it going forward. And that dynamic there of being multi-use cards in, completely different actions in the first place is both the clever part of this game, but also the analysis paralysis style of things as well. As you can see on the board here, I have 2 cards that you can kind of see where they're going or what might be coming up next in each of the 7 different regions that are available to you. The second different aspect on the board is going to be moving your army. You can move your tanks, as you can see, around from region to region. We'll talk about why that matters here in the scoring phase of things with the armies and the threat as we go on. Then you can trade, and this is where the import-export, which again is a slight asymmetry between some countries, because most are going to allow you 2 imports or exports. But here, for example, you can see that China's trade policy allows 3 exports and 3 imports, which basically means you get to trade goods, right? You sell goods for the listed value in the chart that comes with the game, or you buy goods from potentially other players for said value in the first place. And that allows you to manipulate both the resources you're gathering, the resources you're going to need for a lot of these other actions, but then also to refresh some of the cards if you, say, get the right ones or someone else uses yours for your individual commerce cards that are going to be available to you, which, again, each faction has their own separate icon on in the first place. As you're moving these tanks around, as you're investing, essentially putting infrastructure into countries, you get to put down other tokens that are going to be represented by the FDI right here, or you also have bases, and you're going to be planting those as well. And anytime you're placing these, you're also adding influence cubes to the region. And this is the big make it or break it for you if you're looking at it from a mechanic style. How much do I like area majority? It's not area control. It's a slight nuance difference, but it's area majority. And what I mean by that is you can see in both of these regions right here, South Asia and Africa down here, that you have cubes already slatted at the start of the game. And some of these just have 1s on them. But that's also not going to get you tons of victory points. The bigger ones are actually on the bottom. And why that matters and where the differentiation is if you put one of these cubes on the top ones, that is there forever the rest of the game. The cubes on the bottom are potentially replaceable or blockable or movable, if you will. And so if they fill up and somebody else has to put another cube down, like say my yellow in this case for the European Union, I actually slide this one off and these get moved down. And so that's going to be the dynamic that's going on. Now, the tricky point is when you score some of these victory points initially versus what's there later, but that's also going to go into those numbers below each region in terms of who has the most majority when you're doing that scoring aspect. And then that also plays into one of the other special dynamic point differences at the end of rounds 3 and 6, where you're going to be scoring for these other 3 little tokens apart from just the regions. And these are having the most countries allied with you, having the most money here, and having the most troops on the board. And so those dynamics are going to play into effect. And the last point that I alluded to, right, is the tanks. And why that matters is if you look in each of these sections as well, you'll see that they have symbols for these countries. And you're looking at your zone of influence. So if I'm the EU in this case, I have an EU symbol here and an EU symbol here. If people have more army in that area than me, I lose victory points if it's my zone of influence. Now, there's some dynamic mechanic thematic incorporation again. The US and the EU don't threaten each other. And if you choose, say, the military focus that I mentioned earlier, now you get +1 threat wherever you have tanks. So if someone else is really military focused that round and you're not, well, that can change the dynamic of how many more you have than someone else. So it is sort of a Cold War arms buildup, right? It's not that I'm actually going to attack you, but I want to posture like I'm really a big threat. And that's going to cause your morale to go down and for you to lose victory points. And so that's going to be the main interaction on that map in that way. And so again, when you choose to have the ones above the line versus below the line, safety is going to be above the line. It's going to be less points overall. But the tricky point is, again, you might say, well, why, Chris, why isn't everyone just filling up the bottom ones and saying screw the top ones? Because look at these point numbers differential, right? Well, it's because if the top ones aren't full, then the whole thing doesn't score in that way. And so if you don't have it full, well, everybody loses. Mutually assured destruction there in a different thematic incorporation. The last important part that I'm going to cover before giving you more of my pros and cons and things otherwise to know is that this deck right here is going to be very influential because this game in a nutshell is also a slight deck building aspect. Like I mentioned to you at the beginning of the round, you have 6 cards in your hand that you're going to be choosing from. But you already said, Chris, that you only play 4 actions. So at the end of the round, I would have 4 of these in front of me. It's a nice way to keep track of how many you've played. But then I have 2 left. And these 2 left are actually going to influence what I can do in the last and arguably somewhat most important aspect of building up your engine, your world power, your army, whatever you want to call it, right? Is that on the left side of these cards, the ones that are left, you're going to get both of these resources that are mentioned there. The production resource, which whatever that may be in this case, 3 money and 4 money, so 7 money extra total. But then I have a value of 1 and 3 research. And at the end of every round here, you're going to have a market of these cards that are the, asymmetric big portion of this game. And there's going to be a fair number of these sitting there available for, well, acquisition. And they are going to cost you said research in the first place. So this one would be the building my new embassy 4. Improve relations with a country on the board, then you may reset one of your temporary influence in that country's region. And so what that means is, a lot of the time, as I mentioned, you're flipping over these country cards in order to utilize them. And so these cards are not only better, they're more complicated, and they're giving you more options along the way in those 4 main colors that I showed you down below. And this is where I've seen some comments. They say cards like this, especially the blue ones, for example, allowing you to draw more cards and playing another card from your hand are very, 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 very powerful. And that goes into, I guess, a good segue of saying, what do I feel about this game? How do I feel about this game? I mean, this game is absolutely, absolutely fantastic, but it comes with a few caveats at the same time, right? One of those caveats is that balance with this massive deck of asymmetry and, just powers galore as you're deck building and streaming, great power comes great responsibility. The absolute balance of this is going to ultimately be what determines how good of a game this is when it comes to retail. And as playtesters on the forums and elsewhere have said, they feel like, again, and I would not necessarily disagree, that some of these blue cards are really, really powerful in terms of production resources, getting growth cards, drawing more cards in general. This game is also going to be highly dynamic depending on how aggressive and how many times people are going into the military transformers mode, essentially, right? Because it's going to allow for more presence, it's going to allow for more threat, it's going to allow for potentially more negative scoring. But that's going to be group dependent, because if you're group turtles instead, or at the lower player counts, if you are just not as heavily invested in the other areas of the board as these sort of spheres of influence are located, then it's going to be much less so. And that's where I have to sort of say, I don't know how I feel about this yet. It's better in some ways than I think some other automas that I've played in other types of games. If I can find the cards themselves right here. These, for example, are the automa cards where you're flipping them up and it's going to be putting out influence, but you're going to know where it's going and you're going to be able to see and predict where the influence of the cubes for the factions, for example, that are not being played by other players are going to end up at the end of every round. And so it's a lot more predictable of saying, okay, I know that they're going to have more influence here. I need to have more influence over there. Or I need to deal with the threat that they're providing in that regard. So that's going to be reassuring for players that are looking at playing this with less than the most optimal 4-player count, because I would also make that argument that just like Hegemony, again, not having actually played Hegemony, but just what I read, what I hear, and what I've heard people say, the almost unanimous discussion, just like with a root, is that 4 is really going to be the best. It's going to give you the most dynamic experience on the board. And I can't argue against that with this game either, right? More people, more fun, right? But 2 and 3 is still going to be fun. It still was fun. It's just, can you get as much enjoyment out of it in that regard? I know I can, right? But if that is the utmost reason for your acquisition of this game, that's the question you have to ask yourself. Another aspect of things I like the multi-use cards here, of being able to flip them over and have multiple utilizations for what you're going to be trying to do, as well as mitigate in terms of resources needed or influence gained or just costs in general. I love that. That's very clever. It's very unique. I also really like, as you can see up here, the initiative order that you have going on, that you're changing on a round by round basis. So you might not want to go first. It really may not behoove you, but you may also want to. And so it allows you to adapt and move those around depending on reverse victory point scoring order. I actually really like, again, the balance between the top and the bottoms. But again, it's very similar to the card deck here. That is also going to be a critical element, just like the deck. It's also probably not going to be as asymmetric for those that are looking for a hegemony or a root or something like that, right? The basic cards that you're starting off with are, slights. And the rest of it is here, but you're going to have to really emphasize getting this. And this is the other portion of things with the cards I really like, is that the ones that you acquire, the ones that you buy, it's always disappointing when in a deck builder, you get the card and it goes into your discard pile and you're like, well, I hope that comes up sometime soon. But this game doesn't fall into the deck building trap. It allows you to put this on the top of your deck. So you are drawing it next turn period to utilize the cool stuff in the first place that you want and just got, right? It's not like that fear of just never being able to utilize it because you shuffled randomly and someone else shuffled much better and you get screwed and they get to use their cool stuff, or vice versa. It also has ways to winnow your deck, which is the other big deck building mechanic aspect that is often overlooked or troublesome. And so the ability to winnow this deck or shuffle through those cards and draw more of those cards in that way also is very powerful and not overlooked in this game as well. And I like the high risk, high reward sort of area majority where, yeah, you can put them down there. Yeah, you can score some easy points, but is it better short-term hare or is it better slow-term rabbit in terms of what game you're playing as that goes on through the 6 rounds? And that'd be the other thing I'd say is 6 rounds is a lot. 6 rounds can be a little bit of an overstay with that game length that I mentioned. I like the influence of the cubes in the first place as well. The influence on each of these areas, even the black cube here, you see as sort of forces that are already at work in play in that area that you may have to deal with. The incorporation of the theme, as I've mentioned, is extensive. It's well thoroughly researched, and it's incorporated in ways that just logically and historically make sense. The biggest downside, though, is, like I mentioned earlier in the video, the analysis paralysis and the sheer options that are provided on the decision space from cards, board play, countries, multi-use, like I just mentioned, is massive. And that's why your play times are going to be significant, even if you pick things up quickly, unless you're a quick turn player like me and you just say, screw it, right? And that's why my play times tend to be a lot less than everyone else's. But because I'm going off of just, right, go, rather than, that's not me. But if you are, this game is going to drag then a little bit at the higher player counts. It will lessen after repeated plays, but there's just a certain amount of that if you're truly winning is great, Chris, that it's going to be a lot longer because you are not doing it simultaneously. You are one person, player 2, player 3, player 4, player 1, player 2. So you have 16 of that times 6, right? That's a lot of action space. So even if bare minimum that takes 2 minutes per action with the manipulation, the resources, the importing, the exporting, that's, 2.5 hours between round resetting. That's 2.5 hours before scoring, right? All of those other things. And so you can see the time just add up. Now you're going, Chris, we don't take 2 minutes on a turn. Some people do. And I guarantee some people actually take more. But that's the sort of thing that you've got to just be aware of, right? This is going to be heavily group dependent. And it's not nearly going to be as negotiation or bluffing or interactive in those ways of I do you, you do me, we do this together, except for some of the slight influences, like I mentioned with the EU and the Americas, having a no threat situation. And the other aspect, I guess I'd say more so to that, is as I was showing you on the board with the 3 different focuses, if someone is really doing military, this is the dynamic that I'm still not quite sure on. Is it going to influence you out of your strategy and having to adapt? And how comfortable, how willing are you as a person, as a gamer, as a group, going to mitigate against that? Because that might be where some of the experience level or the understanding of the game at different amount of playtime and knowledge could cause a little bit of an imbalance. So again, know your own group from that side of things. So there you go. World Order. Is it right for you based off of those thoughts, comments, questions, and concerns? Let me know what you think. Hegemonic Games, thank you for sending it to me to talk about, and hopefully this is helpful. Figure out whether or not it's right for you.